You're watching Hearthstone Grandmasters, and it is specifically the final. Well, specifically and pacifically, it's the final of APAC here with Tom versus Surrender. It could not be, in my opinion, a better representation of the best that APAC has to offer. In slightly different ways, though, I think their brilliance does manifest in terms of their Hearthstone play. Surrender, to me, is just kind of a baseline, very, very high-level Hearthstone player. You can always expect him to be making good plays, bringing good decks. Whereas from Tom, he seems to fit more into the kind of the mad genius category, where we often see absolute strokes of genius from him with his gameplay, and sometimes weird plays that we don't understand for a long time, even after we've seen them.
It is so true. Surrender is very consistent. The decks that I feel we've never seen anything particularly innovative from his list, but whenever we see the lineup, there's always some solid thinking behind it, very clear logic, and he has the gameplay to back that up. And the results. Surrender has had, I believe, the most top 4 appearances, including the first season of Grandmasters this year for the first 3 weeks. Whereas Tom is somebody that we didn't see very, very often, at least in the first 3 weeks, performing too well. But this week is looking nigh on unbeatable. Just getting so many games in. Zoo gameplay in particularly has been so impressive.
Yeah, finally butting heads together here in the final. Both of them have been looking nigh on unbeatable, for that matter, with Surrender taking an incredible 3-0 sweep there over Tiz on the second semi-final match of the day. Granted, it was with some pretty fortunate draws along the way with the Druid, but I think he showed a very good understanding of the deck, even with the most recent nerf. You know, the fact that you can go Kaothas and then play Nature Studies as specifically the second spell of the turn to still get a 0-mana spell even after the nerf. It's small things like that, I think, that show great practice and understanding of his decks from Surrender. So to get things going right out of the gate here, we are starting off with the Tempo Mage, my favorite deck of the expansion thus far, undeniably, but also a deck that I feel is not the best positioned, if I'm going to be brutally honest, in the current metagame.
I would have to agree. At the beginning of this weekend, we were talking about Rogue and Mage being the weak points, but as it went onward with the matches, we saw Rogue perform pretty well for both Tyler and Surrender, and to the point where Surrender's Rogue has been banned twice today. It's getting already, I think, pretty clear that Mage is the only one that we were justifiably ragging on. And it's to that reason that Surrender, we've hardly even seen him play it on stream. It's LHS, so you can't afford to lose with the deck once, as long as what you believe is your most powerful one can get several wins to make up for it.
So right out of the gate, as is always the case, in my opinion, with the Tempo Mage, interesting decisions to be seen from a certain caster who makes excellent mulligan and early game decision guides. I saw the tip that Shenvala should often be played out just on turn 3. Do you believe this to be one of those games?
The situation I was campaigning for it was against Druid with nothing else on board. There is some reason for playing Shenvala against Priest, but with its Sethic, particularly on the other side, it feels a little bit too risky, because if there's a removal spell or even a buff on the Sethic, then it can get a train going, Shen might not survive, and the end result could be Priest just not even having spent cards by virtue of Sethic regenerating value.
Is it cold in here? Or is it
So already a pretty interesting hand shaping up here, and Surrender, despite not going for the Tempo Shenvala on turn 3, we do see Tempo Shenvala on turn 4 instead, the board having been cleared up. And I guess if you look at the arsenal that Priest has available to clear off boards early on in the game, with no Shadow Word Pain in the deck, there are pretty limited answers to this Shenvala.
Yeah, with the Sethic cleared, it definitely has a bigger chance of the Shenvala surviving, even though you won't necessarily get that on the turn it's played. The big punish, however, is the Cabal Acolyte that could have come down and just stolen the Shenvala straight up with the coin. This is Highlander Priest though, so Surrender took that calculated risk. The Shenvala sticks, and we could see it go off here. However, it has to be its own Ray of Frost target.
You've got to think here from Tom. What information do you have about your opponent's hand from the fact that they just played a Shenvala in terms of your own Ilusha? Does it mean they are likely to have an apprentice or not likely to have an apprentice? Because if they do, you kind of want to just go as quick as possible. Just go coin a Lucia, steal the Apprentice, and cast all their spells.
That's a fair point, but if you miss on the Apprentice, then suddenly you just have 2 mana to work with for the Elucia. I don't know.
That's
I feel
true.
that we've been caster visioning this card a whole lot, and on average it gets played a lot later than the first turn we suggested.
That does seem to be true.
And Surrender does go off with the Shenvala for at least the first activation, but I was surprised to see Evocation be the spell that he used there instead of a Ray of Frost. Even though you would end up damaging your Shenvala, it means you get to keep an Evocation in hand. Also, he misses a ping.
Yeah, he was equally surprised as that one. I mean, I saw the arrow go out, so I think he might have just missed it by a fraction of a second. Before the turn ended. But yeah, it's worth talking about that turn there, because now Evocation has been used up, which is a very crucial card to find extra value, I find a lot of the time, or extra burn against Priest. Whereas he could have, for the cost of damaging and freezing his Shenvala for 2 damage, got out an Apprentice and the 5/5 still at the same time as well.
Yeah, the Cyclone for immediate regeneration. I was looking at that, especially since he had second Ray of Frost, but Surrender is valuing these Rays of Frost for some greater purpose later on. Cram Session with the Azure Explorer is very efficient card draw because this is +2 spell damage, and he picks up, crucially, Alex Straza, which can make this a more viable burn game plan for the Mage later on, where Tom doesn't necessarily expect it.
Yeah, Alex Strauss is huge here, because as soon as he clears some space out of his hand, whether or not he finds the Apprentice, it's got to be said, he will be able to generate a whole bunch of spells with 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 Ray of Frost coming down all on the same turn, and then getting the Cyclone for that extra burn damage.
Well, the Jandis to fill out the curve is looking very solid here. I, again, don't think there's any room for mind games. I want to put the Illusion on the 3/3, and we could just see the value trade and ping here. Are we going to have this argument again?
The question is really just, how are you going to be dealing with this lab partner on the other side of the board? Because if you're not going to clear it, there's real argument to put it on the sandwich, right? Because you don't want to allow it to attack into the taunt straight away.
What to do?
That's true, but I can only imagine with the remaining mana, he's just going to trade the Azure Explorer and ping, and the lab partner will get dealt with.
Sounds pretty clean.
Because the alternative would be Bravesting it, which does not seem worth it whatsoever. We saw how passionately Surrender held on to the first Ray of Frost to make sure.
The thing with the Ray of Frost, for me, it isn't so much that you want to hold on to it. It's kind of just you want to clear hand space is actually the real point for me here, because each Ray of Frost, while taking up 1 hand space, generates 2 spells from Mana Cyclone. So you do need to start getting those cards out of your hand. And because of that specifically, I actually really like this play from Surrender.
Alright, well, it doesn't change the fact that the illusion went on the smaller minion, but I'll definitely hear your point about the hand space. Also because the second half of the Ray of Frost cheapens the Mana Giants immediately, and he did not know he was going to top deck the Apprentice, but that now is huge.
So he can go Apprentice, quadruple spell, I suppose, with the Ray of Frost, but the question does have to be begged as to where everything is going in terms of the actual spells. He could start with Devolving Missiles, I suppose, and hope to get like a higher health minion to just have more health to throw these spells into.
Yeah, I think it's 5 spells here, and even though hand space is a small issue here, because the Mana Giants will go down to 2 mana minimum after the end of this turn, assuming that all of the Rays of Frost gets played, then you don't really need to worry about overdrawing something from your deck, because you can end the turn on the Giant.
Ooh.
Box! It finally got generated after Mage Game and Mage Game that we were talking about. This is the only out. It has finally showed up. But it's definitely not Surrender's only out here, because he's managed to stay quite heavily ahead on board.
I am a little bit I have questions about the end of the turn there from Surrender, because he's just in the Soul Mirror, right, in terms of the clear, so getting every single minion down that you can on the board is a pretty big deal. And so I think going for a double Ray of Frost at the end there that would have allowed him, even if it's targeting his own minions, however you want to do it, it would have allowed him to get down Giant and Cyclone on the same turn, which means he has a big threat in play, and also generates significantly more spells on this turn.
Yeah, it's a very fair point to bring up. It could be that he was just hoping to save a spell for a second round with the Mana Cyclone, but we were talking about how Zoo can be very powerful because it goes all in against Priest. I wonder if there was room to go all in against Tom there. You can see, though, that it's not just Soul Mirror, of course, that he needs to be worried about. There's that natural Shadow Word Ruin and, of course, Zephrys.
Tough choice here, because Power of Creation looks fantastic, but Arcane Breath, there's a dragon in hand. That's going to generate another spell, which can generate another spell when you pair it with the Cyclone. So I think I'm leaning a little bit closer towards the Breath on this turn, even considering you're passing up a lot of value from the Power.
I was about to agree with you. Surrender takes the Power of Creation there. I think the tipping point for my decision-making, at least, was the fact that the Power couldn't be played that turn. So I did like the idea of getting the extra spell, well, 2 extra, essentially, from the Mana Cyclone and the spell that the Arcane Breath gives you, assuming you get anything cheap enough. But Surrender values the guaranteed curve play, which if he is going all in with the minions, it does make sense to some extent, just chaining threats.
So already with these 2 giants in play, this is the potential, of course, for Alexstrasza lethal on the following turn. Tom's going to put a swift end to that predictably with the Shadow Word Ruin, which is, again, a pretty big boon to Surrender, because he went with Power of Creation. It's just another huge threat that he can throw onto the board now and try and once again get that Alexstrasza surprise lethal on the next turn.
He was definitely just looking at this as guaranteed follow-up. He was asking the first question with the 2 giants, answer was there, and I think it's reasonable to assume it would be there, whether it's Shadow Word Ruin or Zephrys, but is the answer to the Power of Creation going to be there?
Ooh.
I'm looking at the beast, I'm not gonna lie.
Right. Yeah, because, well, the kicker is, right, it's more than 15 damage that you are then putting on the board. Whereas Reckless Rocketeer, the charge damage is not useless. It's still good to get that to face. But if Alexstrasza is coming down, it does somewhat overwrite that extra value you're gaining from the charge.
My thoughts exactly, Dara. And while this is a card I don't even see very often in Battlegrounds, it's looking very strong here. Shadow Word Ruin just played. Tom out of answers in his regular hand, at least. But there's things he can discover, potentially.
Yeah, there's a few ways he can make this a bit more amenable.
Can't be accounting for Alexstrasza in particular. But either way, he has to do something with Surrender's hand, because even Cobalt Spell can... Okay, you can try and hit Wave of Apathy as well. But
that's true.
You would have mana for doing that even after a Lazul turn. But
he just plays Alex. Amber Watcher, nice heal.
Yeah, Tom is just dead. Of course, he would not have expected natural Alex. That's... Oh my goodness. That was so brave from Tom.
Oh my god, what a win from Surrender! Picking the Power of Creation that we weren't even advocating for at the start. Getting the Beast, getting the Alexstrasza, all working together so beautifully. That is a Surrender win, if ever I've seen one.
The game plan was very, very straightforward from Surrender after he took Alex and played the double beasts. I wonder if Tom had some room to be a bit more reactive there. Yes, he could have whiffed if Surrender's had 0 freeze. And more I think about it, he saw a bunch of Rays of Frost, so that could be why Tom was thinking I should just prioritize getting my own board down. But we have to also consider it's not necessarily just Alexstrasza that lets Surrender deal a swift lethal there. He could have generated fireballs or even a preemptive pyroblast or a turn leading up into that. The taking 18 part was very iffy.
I see your point, but I think looking at the context of Surrender's hand, of Tom's hand, I actually really like the play he went for there in the end, because he didn't have any way to guarantee a board clear. You know, we were looking at going for Cobalt Spellkin to try and hit Wave of Apathy to delay the problem, but he needed a way to actually fight back onto the board, which is, I think, on average, what Alex Straza did offer him, and then try and use the Spellkin to heal up afterwards with Renew and the any other healing spells that he can generate thereafter. It was risky, for sure, but I think it was a well-calculated risk most of the time.
It's fair. I feel like going for Cobalt Spellkin is going for fighting back on the board. Again, you're not guaranteed to get Wave of Apathy, but the fact that you can start with Lazul, and if that whiffs, you can go for the Spellkin. I could just be caster visioning, of course, but remains to be seen. It's also, of course, the fact that we need to focus on the fact that this Mage is up again for the first time in what feels like forever. It feels like Mage has been getting tons of losses, and Surrender's hand is very well positioned to be the perfect one.
Yes, this hand is the dream right out of the gate. Insane amounts of tempo are going to be generated right from the get-go, assuming any kind of decent spells can be found. Because even though it's mostly value that you're generating, I suppose, at the start with the Cyclones, when Giants come down, when the cheap spells, the secrets, the mirror images, when all of that starts to come together, the tempo will be realized.
Mana Burn is a very interesting option because you can shut off or at least delay the Apprentice pop-off turns using that card. It's more so a case that the other two options seem very slow to me.
Yeah, I think I would definitely just pretty much snap pick Mana Burn because, like you say, even if it's not the... I was going to say, even if it's not the Apprentice turn specifically that you're denying, it's just shutting them down for the first few turns, allowing you to get on the board and get the swings through to face.
Well, I see a Shinvala that can come down on 3. It is not very likely to live, but I think that's fine because Surrender can pop off the following turn with a little bit more flexibility. Okay, popping off now, it's awesome if you get a cheap one-cost spell off of the magic trick, which is, of course, very likely to happen.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it, from Surrender, because he knows at this point that there are no soul fragments in the deck, which means he's getting in there before Shard Shatter Mystic can start to do its nonsense with clearing the board, which is, I think, the main reason why he's popping off as early as he is right here. Okay.
Elemental Allies has a good chance of getting activated, actually.
Yeah.
Cyclone and Mana Giant. You obviously cheat this card bonus most of the time. You're not actively going to wreck your curve just to draw 3 spells, but it can happen fortuitously more often than you'd think.
Well, there's the clear he was looking for. Shard Shatter not needing to do anything at all here with Hero Power Blade Dance. Able to sweep up the entire board here. It's looking all right for Tom, given how powerful of a starting hand Surrender had.
So, going back to the point of why I wanted to go Shinvala last turn is that if you pop off and don't hit anything to follow up with this turn in terms of minion pressure or card draw, which he only had 3 spells generated, it makes everything rather awkward. But the fact that Surrender did hit Azure Explorer, I think, smooths out the curve pretty nicely.
So you're thinking that's the line instead of draw with AI?
That's also very valid. Both of these are generated, so they cheapen the Mana Giant. Mana Giant is definitely where my head's at, just trying to turbo that out as soon as possible.
Yeah, I think I like going for the AI here, because even though Apprentice has come down, this hand is not doing it at the moment. You know, it doesn't have the insane combos that you need to start popping off right out the gate with.
To be fair, against Demon Hunter, the pop-offs coming down soon kind of works well with your overall game plan of you need to get Mana Giant down because your minions are not going to get there against a deck that has Eldrazi Warblades for healing, the small minions at least. And freezing their minions is not going to do much either because they're mainly relying on these Marrow Slicers to go face. So Render's first priority is trying to get down his bigger threats.
Yeah, and speaking of bigger threats, I think we can quite clearly see where the two players' mindsets are, because Surrender just picked an 8-mana spell over Ray of Frost on that turn, clearly anticipating the power of Deep Freeze later on, which is true if you can get there. And then Tom denies him his mana and hits him in the face, very clearly laying out the game plan of, I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to kill you very soon.
Mm-hmm. Deep Freeze, of course, Surrender wanted to get the water elementals, which can freeze the opponent's face, but it's looking like he will not have time to do that. Not saying that the Deep Freeze pick was wrong, because there are not that many good Ray of Frost targets anyway on the other side, especially with one already in hand. I kind of think Shenvala just as a bait here is where I'd be at.
I mean, it's almost more dire than that even, is there? Like, you kind of have to freeze just to stop even this 2 damage from coming to face, because that on its own is already too much.
That's fair.
Hide behind your servants. I will still find you.
Oh, Tom, however, falls into Surrender's trap, playing the cane before the mirror images comes down. Checkmate, my friend.
Right, how is he removing the cane?
My hand is too full.
Technicality, nothing more.
Because you can freeze the cane, but you can't silence its effect with just a freeze. So,
Yeah, obviously a slight amount of sarcasm in my point, but yeah, it's not looking good here is the point for Surrender. His hand is way too clunky, no way to clear up the board effectively and stop any of this damage coming to face.
why do you have to throw in the disclaimer there? I wanted to go along with your sarcasm and bait some people into thinking you were serious, Dara.
I mean, I think I do a good enough job already of making people think I'm stupid. I don't need your help along the way.
I am not seeing the line here for Surrender. He can freeze the minion damage, of course, but it's always scary for things to go over the top, weapons. And in the case it's not there, it does make sense, of course, for him to set up his own amounts of... It's not close to lethal, though, for Surrender. That, however, is lethal for Tom even before the Lapidary with the Eldraki Second Slice Chaos Strike and the Volpera Scoundrel.
Very nicely done. I think demonstrating one of the one of the reasons that you're bringing Demon Hunter in the first place, because even though Mage is not the most popular of decks at the moment, it's got to be said, specifically Tempo Mage, the Demon Hunter does have a great matchup in my opinion there, being able to clear off the minions nowhere near enough time for the Mage to get going with its power combos, and Demon Hunter getting a well-deserved win, even against a hand that started with Apprentice, Cyclone, Coin, Shenvala. Like, it was the juice right at the start there for Surrender, and it still wasn't enough to get the job done.
Yeah, the Shenvala never really ended up getting played. I still wonder if there was any room to get that down, and now I'm rescinding my opinion of it just like being more important to give the Mana Cyclone's Apprentice turn more mana to pop. I wonder if it just soaked up 5 damage as a pseudo taunt minion, if that could have helped in that regard. But in any case, it's all one water under the bridge because that Mage is out of the way for Surrender. I don't think it's a huge problem for Surrender, though, because so far, every time we've seen him play on stream, it's the Druid that's been the MVP.
Yep, that's definitely the case. And going to be lining up the Priest first against Demon Hunter. A matchup that I've definitely had to kind of swing my opinion on back and forth, because traditionally you have to appreciate that Priest is weak to these kinds of decks. The decks that go for combos or huge burst damage in one, all at one go, instead of fighting for board. That is where Priest generally struggles. But I think the more I see it play out, I actually appreciate that the Priest has a pretty good chance in the matchup. They have the ability to lock down the board early on. They have Apotheosis. They have plenty of weapon destruction when Surrender is playing Ooze, Sticky Finger, and of course Zephrys. So I think this is a decent counter queue, if not an especially strong one for Surrender.
Yeah, the particular list from Surrender having the Sticky Finger on top of the Ooze, as you said, would be very, very useful in this matchup. Ooze is already available. And on top of that, getting Vile Fiend down early you can't underestimate the power of just minions sticking for Priest, because every single one threatens an Apotheosis landing on it and healing the damage that Tom is already starting to pile on.
Okay, and speaking of damage that he's starting to pile on, that is obviously the primary win condition that you're looking to get against Priest, in terms of just hitting them in the face and hope that that gets there. But he already has a hand that can quite easily activate Magtheridon with, you know, be it the Blade Dance to take out the 1-3s, or now the Shard Shatter plus Jailer combo to get a fragment in the deck and then destroy it, which could be pretty powerful against Priest. You know, it doesn't have unlimited removal for big minions.
I mean, I have to say, even though coining Magtheridon after you see that Spirit Jailer draw into going for the Shard Shatter with the Jailer next turn is ambitious, because the Priest could land some 1-3 and you might not get the Magtheridon activation immediately. I was definitely not looking at coining Kayn immediately, knowing that the Vile Fiend would be active going into this turn. I'm really surprised to see that.
Yeah, I mean, there aren't that many ways, putting a lot of mustard on that word, for Surrender to answer this Kayn. He does have Broomstick, I suppose, in the deck, which is yet another way to be able to clear it off. But without that little bit of extra help, this is a Kayn that gets to attack face twice over the course of the game, which is not something that you always expect to happen.
Yeah, it's probably above average. I was just wondering how much Tom valued the coin, because the first play I was looking at was just equip Eldrazi Pass. It does, however, work out very nicely for him here, because he can get rid of the Vile Fiend and still maintain the Kayn alive. Or he could just ignore it completely because he has a read on no Apotheosis.
tom60229 has clearly just stuck a piece of paper across the middle of his screen that covers the entire board. The only part he cares about is Surrender's face. Which is how I think most of us feel, to be perfectly honest. God damn, is he handsome.
I was about to make that joke, but then I found it a bit awkward, so I'm glad you did it for me. Okay, Surrender now at least has the mana to remove that Kayn with the Time Rip. It is very slow, and of course this is a weapon, so the Ooze has to be playing on his mind as well, but in terms of weapons he would rather deny Tom, I'd have to imagine the Marrow Slicer is more threatening, because it's not like Surrender cares about Tom healing up more, as Surrender is the defender in this matchup.
The future is clear.
But I'm wrong once again.
Just trying to go with... I'm not even sure if he's going to go for the Ooze or the Hero Power, because this isn't really the weapon that the thing that you want to ooze away in the matchup by any stretch.
Yeah, with the pick of Soul Shear, we could just look at Trade Soul Shear instead, which is, you know, removing more damage than the weapon.
Yeah.
Looking at it again, it could be more so that Surrender values the Time Rip for a better target later on, with Magtheridon being a possibility. I can also see that.
That is an awkward skull, however.
Yeah, gonna get locked in from the right side later on.
So there is, again, the potential for a preemptive Magtheridon. It's annoying, of course, because, like you said, Surrender can go for some kind of a buff to get it out of range on the following turn. But I think for the most part, it's reasonable to expect that you'll be able to clear it off on the following turn if he went for that line.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable because he had Blade Dance and Shard Shatter available for the next turn, assuming this turn was going to be Magtheridon Spirit Jailer. But Tom is just wasting no time with the Magtheridon whatsoever. It's a reasonable thing to assume that it wouldn't stick against Priest, because they have not just this Time Rip, Shadow or Death, Zephyrus, even Soul Mirror is a way to deal with it. So it looks like Tom just doesn't care about the Magtheridon at all in particular. And while that skull was drawn in an awkward position, it's definitely the case that you can play the skull without the outcast value and still have that be a decent thing. However, not better than getting immediately right off the top more damage. So
that's what Tom has been playing for this entire game. You clear off the board when you absolutely have to, and then you smack your opponent in the head. That's the game.
And Surrender did hold on to this Ooze to deal with a better weapon, so I'd have to imagine it comes down right now. But Floating this much mana cannot feel good. It's very much the case that Surrender is not hoping to race or pressure down tom60229. He's just trying to outlast the damage, which is a very, very tall order without Apotheosis, without Renew in hand yet, and just the penance for healing at this point.
Interesting. I was going to say at the start of that turn that it looked like Tom's master plan of saving the Magtheridon to come down on that turn was coming into effect. But you save it for turn 7, Magtheridon plus Shard Shatter. It's a great combo to go for. But he holds back on it there in the end, not even wanting to go for it because I guess he thinks these 2 minions are more likely to be able to connect face, weirdly enough, than a 12-12.
Or it could be that he just doesn't think minions will be able to connect at all because Surrender's hand could be all removal. And so Tom just wants to fit in the hero power every single turn, which is fair, I have to say. One thing I didn't notice, though, as a big side effect of Surrender playing Soul Shear is that his Zephyrus is not active because of the Soul Fragments. Disaster.
I wonder...
Well... Alright, Derek disappeared there for a minute. I teed up that big reaction for nothing at all, but it is the case now that Surrender is able to remove a couple minions, goes back up to 20, which is not so bad whatsoever, but if Tom can follow up with another Soul Shard Lapidary, find his other Marrow Slicer, then things will get dicey really, really quickly. Tom with the Spectral Sight off the top makes things a lot easier to get his card draw going. The skull, however, is well locked in the middle now. Surrender starting off with some digging because he did not want to play Galakrond and give up the healing hero power that I'm sure he wants to fit in for every single turn. But from that Thought Steal, he picks up some amazing cards. The Eldraki can heal Surrender for at least 4, more if he picks up even more copy effects from Tom's deck. Chaos Strike, Twin Slice could be a huge amount of healing for Surrender. It's just a question of whether he wants to equip it right now and give Tom the knowledge that it's there. He also picked up the Ooze though, so he knows it's not in Tom's hand, so Surrender can just equip the weapon and be reasonably sure that it can connect a couple times. And Surrender having the Ooze in the first place is big because that's a second way to remove a weapon from Tom.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool little combo that he has available there where it gives him the information to equip it and also an extra ability to clear things off. And I really like that he is equipping it now. Whether or not he had the Ooze information, I think what you want to go for there is just getting the damage to face. You know, there's no other weapon buffs that you're going to have access to, so the healing is as good now as it'll ever be.
Welcome back, Derek. I hope
Hello.
You find it funny to know that I lost you at the exact point where I said this Zephyrus is not active because of the soul fragments and had a very awkward silence afterward.
Well, Soul
For the
Mirror.
meantime, it doesn't seem like it's a huge deal that the Zephyrus isn't active because Surrender still had Soul Mirror and Plague of Death to answer boards, and he's healed all the way back to 24.
Okay, Circle of Hatred. Yeah, I believe that card's called. Is definitely not the best card that you're looking for here, but does allow for Tom to go for a slightly more late game plan, because I think what this whole situation seems to be setting up for is the idea that his immediate push onto the board, his damage through to face, has not worked. He needs to come up with some kind of a later game plan if he's going to be able to take this all the way.
Yes, so the Cycle of Hatred will possibly generate him a bunch more 3/3s. It's going to be difficult to maneuver because I think Priest Minions tend to be above 3 health, but combined with the Blade Dance, it could get some board presence going for Tom, which is essential because he is not running the Glaive-bound Adepts in his list. This Murazon, though, getting the card draw for Surrender is huge, especially since he has drawn a Fragment now. Zephyrus is active. I think everything's coming up Surrender at the moment. For the rest of the turn, I wouldn't even mind just seeing a wave of apathy thrown away to not overdraw. Because Surrender has no shortage of ways to deal with minions. He has Death, Plague of Death, and Time Rip.
And that's the big thing, right? Is that here Surrender has multiple ways to clear off these big minions, be it Magtheridon that comes down, even be it just the bunch of 3/3s that come into play. The Plague of Death should be able to deal with the Cycle of Hatred. So for Tom, even though he's going for this alternate game plan of sweeping up all these minions, trying to generate big board after big board, it is, I am doubtful as to whether this will be able to get there.
Doubtful as well. I'm already thinking in the territory of this Vulpera Scoundrel needs to give inner demon at some point,
right?
Or the damage to pile up. For Surrender though, definitely wasn't expecting this type of refill. After you've seen Militia, you tend to believe Demon Hunter will only play 1 or 2 minions on board per turn. But it's definitely not a problem. He has either Zephrys or the Plague as a way of dealing with these.
Yeah, multiple ways to go about this. I think you'd have to imagine that this is a worthy use of Plague, because any small minion that comes down, be it the Lapidary, can be dealt with Shadow of Death. Obviously, he still has multiple answers to Magtheridon with Time Rip, Galakron, Zephrys, and Shadow of Death. So he can get away here, it would look like to me, with a Plague of Death. But he disagrees once again.
Yeah, we could also just see him go for a Wave of Apathy, which is, I think, how the turn's going to end up, and bait Tom into committing more into a bigger Plague of Death. It's not to say that that's for sure the play, because he still does end up taking 3 damage there. I guess with the taunt generation though, it does seem like a worthy trade-off.
Gets the wrong option there, and it's one of those weird situations where I think it was probably correct to just click on Eldrazi Warblades no matter what, because that's the only one that you want in that situation, to be honest.
Yeah. You don't want the Magtheridon to clog up your hand space.
Yeah, not really.
Well, that Lapidary pickup for Tom is absolutely huge. Crimson Hothead blew by this 10 damage, and Tom gets to connect. This is what he was setting up for. And Surrender deliberately chose to leave 3 damage on the board. We'll see whether or not it's going to be relevant. I think he's still very fine since he has Eldrazi and Zephrys.
That is an interesting card to get there all of a sudden for Surrender. You can't really afford to go for it quite yet until you've played out the Zephrys as the main thing there, and probably Apotheosis as well, or Tom will just throw that away and your healing is gone. But it's another tool in Surrender's utility belt the Priest seems to always have access to.
Yeah, it would be very cool if he could steal ways to buff this Eldrazi Warblades and then just heal up like a Demon Hunter would, but definitely risky this turn. I would agree with just taking the guaranteed clear here. He has seen most of the natural damage in Tom's list played out already. Just has to account for this other Vulpera Scoundrel.
And while you do have to think about a more long-term game plan here, and Plague of Death is the board clear, you know, he has to be somewhat greedy with that, I'm still kind of... I have questions about Surrender's line to go with loading up the board and playing Wave of Apathy there instead. Because 3 damage connecting to the face is quite a big deal at this point. It's not like Wave of Apathy deletes all damage for the turn. It's every single little difference that makes a big deal, whereas this single target removal is what he has plenty of here.
Conversely, though, you can see the reasoning for Surrender trying to get some board presence in that window where he was okay with 3 damage, because he really wants to stick an Apotheosis target. And now that the Ooze has been drawn for Tom, that's the 2 damage heal from the Eldrazi delete from Surrender's hand as well. I have to imagine Ooze will come down this turn. For the rest of the board, though, it's very awkward because I'd imagine he wants to maneuver Zephrys into giving him healing. So even if it's something like, say, Karj, Ooze, Zephrys, Healing Touch, you leave 5 on the board, but you get probably the most efficient Zephrys healing here. That is to
Right.
say, will Zephrys even give healing touch if you're at 11?
I must consider.
Alright, this is Surrender saying, I have seen double lapidary, I have seen twin slices, and I have seen one of the Volpera cards played.
And
It's risky.
this is the list, of course, without the Glaive-bound Adepts as well. So the damage is starting to get limited. You know, this is why players are running the Glaive-bounds, why they're playing Wand Makers, why they're playing the just any way to generate those extra 1-mana spells or extra damage to get the twin slices to close out the game.
Worth noting that if the Volpera picked up Inner Demon, it would just be GG here. But the second Volpera for Tom was very lackluster. I think he ended up taking the Mist there, and it's just Consume Magic. Which I would have to assume he would rather have put on the Karsh? Question mark?
Right.
Like, he could I-beam the Ooze and silence the Karsh. But I guess it's all the same if he's just going Shard Shatter with this Magtheridon anyway.
And Tom, you can see how reluctant he'd been to play out the Magtheridon over the course of the game. As it gets longer and longer, he knows Zephrys, Time Rip, Galakron, so many different ways to clear this off. And finally, he feels it's his last vestige of hope to stick something on the board. And Surrender, with a couple of ways to heal up still, with Apotheosis, Zephrys, the hero power, is, I think, maybe finally getting over the top of the hill and approaching safe territory.
Yeah, it is huge also that he picked Haunt on top of this, so I think he can very confidently just go for Shadow Word Death, Cabal Acolyte, heal his face, and if that thing sticks, then Apotheosis means he is home free. Alternatively, we could just see Death and then Zephrys for healing. One way or another, whether he gets healing now or sets up a minion that's likely to stick for Apotheosis later, I think that's just pretty much everything Tom has to offer.
Right, I mean, that's the one thing to consider, right, is if you go for Natalie Celine here, even though it seems way too greedy at first glance, if you stick Apotheosis on that, the game does end. It's not purely a meme at that point, I don't think.
Yeah, it would have to be with perfect knowledge of what Tom has left by that point, which Surrender should have with Deck Tracker, to be fair. And he's seen both of the Volpera spells.
Okay. I
thought Zephrys would give Holy Light there.
Yeah, so did I. So did I.
Such a beautiful.
Whoa, huge chunk of damage soaked up by the Cabal Acolyte there. That is a big deal again to keep Surrender alive and in the game.
The fact that the taunt came down was so crucial here.
Okay, if you're going to go Ruin, let's get this order correct, Surrender. Apotheosis second, or you're going to be in some big trouble.
And that, I believe, has to be GG now. Damage is just not there in Tom's remaining cards, and that means Demon Hunter has fallen yet again.
And this is a huge deal for the matchup overall, and also, it's got to be said, specifically for Surrender, because this was his counter queue going into the Demon Hunter after it took down the Mage. If that went down, he'd be relying on only his Druid to try and complete all the reverse sweep to take down Tom. So huge deal there, of course, for Surrender in taking down the warriors. Oh, sorry, the Demon Hunter, sorry, with his priest. But now the real big difference is that Tom, contrary to almost everyone else in Grandmasters, apart from like Briarthorn over in the Americas Grandmasters, he's got his Zoo Warlock left waiting, ready to go to try and take down the priest.
And Tom has played this deck absolutely out of his mind. Even the times we've seen him miss the Dark Lair and the big all-at-once pop-off turn, he instead just set up patiently for a much later pop-off turn with the Flesh Giants. And he's just been fearlessly putting himself at, 4 HP, 3 HP, as long as there's no minion on the other side. Priest doesn't have burst damage naturally in the deck. He was taking advantage of that fact. And we could see Tom maneuver this to a victory once again in the matchup that I believe is the reason for bringing Warlock in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. This is why people are going for it. I mean, also in addition to the fact that if it does hit the dream with Dark Glare cheating out like 10 mana in a turn, getting you these Flesh Giants down right at the start, there's nothing that can beat her. It doesn't really matter whether you're playing against Priest, Druid, Warrior, Mage, Rogue. The list is endless. You're going to be beating all of those matchups. And I think the real thing that I've started to realize upon seeing this deck played in a different way is the flexibility of it. You know, we always talk about the power of Dark Glare, but the more I've seen Tom play it, it really feels like there's so much more to be explored in the deck than just cheesing out the game by cheating a bunch of mana.
Yeah, it seems aside from the Dark Glare game plan, the only other game plan is the one we've seen Tom execute so beautifully, which is multiply the Flesh Giants and get them all down at the same turn, which you need to do with Expired Merchant and good timing, because there are some hands where after the Flesh Giant gets too cheap, suddenly the merchants are discarding the Nightshade Matron instead of the Flesh Giant. So it takes a lot of maneuvering there. We saw Tom with a very cool overdraw to get the full board clear. I would have to expect no less than that quality of gameplay to beat Surrender, because even if this Zoo gets past the Priest, the remaining deck for both players then would be the trump card for each of them, I would have to say.
Right, yeah, exactly. It's going to be a very, very close end to the series no matter what, because you've got to say for Surrender, even though he's up in the series now, 1 game away from being our Week 2 champion, if he loses against the Zoo with his Priest, he's going to have to take it on with the Druid, which I'd have to imagine is not the best matchup up against the Zoo, which can hyper-dominate the board at the start of the game. So a critically important game at this juncture for Surrender if he wants to be crowned champion.
And right off the bat, I'm interested by this mulligan from Tom, where the tour guide is kept, despite the Flame Imp also being kept. So to me, these two don't work together very well unless you have, of course, Dark Glare. Flame Imp as a turn 1 play, sure, and I could also see Tour Guide as a turn 1 play, but if it's just, you don't really want to be playing Tour Guide on 2. So in my opinion, it made more sense to say toss the Tour Guide and look for Dark Glare, but of course Tom has way more experience on this deck, and we'll see if that plays out for him well later on. For Surrender, no question about just keeping the penance here.
Yeah. It's just a nice way to keep the board clear at the start of the game. Flame Imp must die, or you're going to be taking an awful lot of damage right out the game.
And the card that Tom has drawn now, even though it's not playable on 2 mana, is something that, as we were doing our testing, I did advocate for keeping against Priest. It makes a lot more sense to do so when you are on coin and able to the Thrasher with Dark Glare. That's when things get really out of hand. But just the 4/5 body is something that Priest really struggles to deal with if they did not come onto board first.
And I think already, even though it's not an especially in-depth interaction once you get to know the deck a little bit better, we're seeing from Tom the reason to hold on for Tour Guide. It's to not use the hero power. That's why it's powerful, because as soon as he finds himself Diseased Vulture, Dark Glare, Flesh Giant, any of these cards that benefit off of a cheap hero power, he can just let rip and be in an incredibly strong situation.
But for Surrender, coining out that and seeing this window as, with this board, you can't deal with both halves of this, is huge, because now he gets to land Apotheosis.
Oh!
That's the nightmare for Tom.
That is absolutely insane. Even with here, Tom being able to go Nightshade Matron, which is very powerful, make no mistake, especially with the Dark Glare. Surrender has, I think, kept himself in with a chance of winning this game, where previously there was no chance.
There was a chance at the beginning, which he gave himself the best shot at, but now for Tom, we've entered phase 2. Dark Glare is available. Can start popping off next turn, getting really scary, but Surrender, having held on to this penance, is still big. Surrender can gain back the tempo this turn, but Tom can pop off next turn.
Yeah, it was kind of a tough choice here for Surrender as to how he wanted to approach this game plan, but he's clearly laying out his philosophy here, which is don't go too heavy on the removal. Go on the offensive, lock down this board, and make it difficult for your opponent along the way. But no matter how much you try and fight for board, in a situation like this, it's just not going to be good enough.
Second Dark Glare, Flame Imp, have 4 mana available. He can play down the Neverset Thrasher, he can protect something with the Og Merchant. Oh my goodness. It is a good thing for Surrender that he spent the turn not playing Penance like I wanted to, but copying the Nightshade Matron, which is probably the best minion you can possibly get on Karj because of that rush being threatening. And so I think Tom has to think about how he wants to play around that, if at all. And that's why he for the taunt instead.
Very smart, this line. I like this a lot from Tom. It allows him to keep the Nightshade Matron inside of Karj, safely hidden away for the moment. As for Surrender, the Breath of the Infinite being active, if you want to call it that here with the Dragon, is actively bad for him.
Yeah, it is actively bad. He wants the Karj to die off, but even so, it is clearing off the mid of the board alongside Penance. I think you still take that if you're Surrender. Yeah. So just trade Breath and get rid of one Dark Lair. Then Tom has a 3/2 Dark Lair and 2 Neferset Thrashers in hand. So it's immediate activations on the other Dark Lair outside of the hero power.
Right. Still pretty insane, though. It's got to be said, just being able to tap for 0 mana, double Thrasher. It's a lot of pressure that's coming towards Surrender's side of the board, but even having said that, he's approaching the late game stages here. If Renew can find him a little bit of extra, sustainability until he hits Plague of Death, he's getting there.
Yeah, he is absolutely holding on, and it's a big deal that there's a Nightshade Matron in this Karj, but Ray's dead for Tom. Oh my gosh.
What?
Flesh Giant. Flame generation. Okay, this whole hand is looking like it could come down very soon.
Flesh Giant, Neferset, yep, sign me up.
Uh-huh. Of course, with this Zoo deck, even though you've already cheated out like 6 mana, you need to think about, can I cheat out even more? Can this other Thrasher come down? But it just did not add up at that point. And even though a Nightshade Matron can come down and trade off a Neferset Thrasher, this Flesh Giant is really the big pressure point for Surrender. Fishing for Shadow or Death. It's the smaller one, or Penance rather, would be better.
Yeah, I mean, he was really fishing for the, I think Wave of Apathy as well would be insane with Cabal Acolyte to lock down this board. But like you said, the Nightshade Matron in the Karj is still a very nice way to make this a little bit less instantly kill-youable.
So I think this Karj is always trading into Dark Lair. It's just the question of you want to whether you want to trade Matron into 4/5 and Penance on Flame Imp, or Matron and Penance on the Flesh Giant, which is technically removing more damage on board. And also the Thrashers are getting to the point where Tom doesn't have that many attacks with them left before he's close to dying himself. Of course, you can't deny the relevance of having a 5/1 stick on the board. Oh, interesting.
He leaves up the Thrashers on purpose to allow Tom to damage himself. This is 6 damage straight to the face. He will be left at 8 health. So Tom can't go all face here.
And Surrender realizes that he's only dead to double Soulfire, I believe. And they would discard themselves if that's the exact hand from Tom. Tom can fit in a tap, of course. But yeah, this is very brave from Surrender, but I like it.
Same. I think it's how it's got to be played.
And speaking of bravery, Tom is the one who has just not shown any fear whatsoever to go down to the bare minimum of his health. But is he willing to take 8 damage between these Thrashers and his hero power this turn?
I mean, there's extremely limited burst in the priest deck at all. You know, you're looking at them having to get Shadow Madness or generate Shadow Madness, something like that. Even Holy Smite now, to the recent change, cannot go face anymore.
And also the fact that Tom doesn't have any Shadow Madness-sized targets is very relevant as well. It would have to be actually some combo with this Inner Fire for Tom to die, obviously. But Tom did not tap there. And he's not attacking with... Wow. This is... It's Zephyrus, of course, is the burst that he was scared of.
Is this lethal? You can go Inner Fire, attack.
And Fireball.
That's
It's
exactly lethal!
Oh my god! Yep, Surrender's counted it up once, twice, just making sure, but that is 5 plus 6. Perfect mana. Tom absolutely hates to see it.
Brutal way for Tom to be kicked out of week 2 as the second place finisher, even holding back on the Thrasher to try and stop any kind of Zephyrus lethal from being able to get there. But with his hands up in the air, clearly elated, Surrender, after just endless, it seems, top 8 performances both last season and this season in the Swiss, takes such a well-deserved victory here, doing it again with style.
That last game was so well played on both sides. Tom, there we couldn't think of the exact burst he was playing around until it actually got drawn by Surrender.
Yep.
Not attacking with the Thresher and not tapping there meant that he was alive past Fireball from Zephyrus, and if his minions stuck, then he could just deal a counter lethal. But that exact combination of Inner Fire, Fireball, was what he was not expecting. And it's all the legacy of Surrender's plays of going very aggressively for minions. When I was talking about Penance turn after turn, it never got played towards the end there.
Yeah, exactly. There were some alternate lines I think that could have been taken to clear off the board a little bit more aggressively. But I think what Surrender was showing there was a constant philosophy of keeping the board is so critical in that matchup at the expense of health, at the expense of even giving your opponent free taps, because as soon as you have board, they are just dead because of the amount of self-damaging that the Zoo does over the course of the game. And as a result of that, taking a look at the bracket, we can see just how things shook out today, with Surrender ending up our week 2 champion. And with a top 4 performance last week, I'm just going to say he's absolutely 100% guaranteed to be getting through to Division A, because you can't really expect any better than that.
Absolutely. This was a banger of a final, despite it not going to the full 5 games. It was our only series today that wasn't a 3-0 sweep, both Tom and Surrender getting very dominant performances against Tyler and Tiz, respectively. Although we also have to focus a bit on Tyler, because this has been his second top 4 in a row, also in a very good position to make Division A. And for Tiz, I do expect great things from him as the weeks continue. It's looking very scary now, though, for any player who has not made it on stream yet.
Yep, despite what Tyler's been playing a lot on his stream, I don't think he's going to be one of the guys falling down to Division B. Division A looks to be where he is headed for sure as we head into the round robin. There is, of course, one final week of Swiss that we are going to be playing out next week, which is going to be Specialist. That's going to be an entirely different kettle of fish. You know, Conquest and Last Hero Standing are comparable in how they work. You both have to bring 4 different archetypes to each. It's just how you have to win with them that differs. Specialist, you bring in 1 class and you have 2 side decks where you get to swap out 5 of your cards each. So who knows how that is going to shake out when that rolls around, and who's going to be able to prey on the slightly different play styles that Specialist does afford you. Should be a lot of fun.
I'm super excited to see if this week is any indication. I believe the majority of APAC holds Bomb Warrior as the strongest deck in high regard, at least in the LHS format. But that could be turned on its head for Specialists, because if you make the read that the majority of the field is bringing Bomb Warrior, you could just bring a deck that has a lot of weapon removal in it and go all in on that. It's a lot of mind games to be had, and I think people that prepare very hard will be especially rewarded going into week 3.
Absolutely. And as you just saw there, you can go to playhearthstone.com/esports if you want any further information about any of our Grandmasters, the schedule, how Grandmasters works in general. All the information is to be found there. And also here on the Hearthstone Esports YouTube channel, make sure that you are subscribing so that you're always notified when we go live. But while we are done here in APAC for the day and for the week overall, still plenty more Hearthstone to come for today. We have Europe coming up next with Raven and Sottle. Can X-Blies do the undoable and just continue to absolutely dominate the European scene? Or will there be an upset of literally anyone else winning? We'll have to see coming up next. And then, of course, America's at the end of the day. So from Gia, myself, all of production, thank you for watching us here. We will see you next week. But for now, joining you alongside us, I'm sure, we'll be watching Europe. Enjoy.